Hey Podcast Babe, welcome to season 9 of the Podcast Babes podcast. My name is Anna Klasse, host of this pod and founder of the Podcast Babes. Every week, I interview and inspire a female podcaster here who has made her podcast work for her and her business. So tune in to learn from her mistakes, create your own profitable podcast. Here's today's episode. Hey Podcast Babes, welcome to a new episode. Today I'm here with Jessica Osborn. She is an online business strategist and marketing coach and host of She's the Business podcast. She's also a published co-author and travel-obsessed mom of 2. She has over 25 years of experience building businesses, including 2 of them of her own since 2010. Jessica specializes in marketing strategy for high-ticket services, helping other female coaches reach multiple 6-figure years in less than 20 hours a week without big advertising budgets or time-consuming cold sales, so they can enjoy more time for family and life. She's incredibly passionate about changing our perspective on work and success, proving it's possible to prioritize family life and be highly successful in business without burning yourself to the ground. Jessica, I'm so excited to have you on a podcast. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Anne. It's really awesome to be here, and I know that we're going to have a good chat today. It's so nice to see you again.
Yeah, nice to see you again too. Yeah, because we actually did a podcast recording in the past. I don't remember how long ago. It's a while ago for your podcast, of course. So that was super fun. We'll link it in the show notes if you want to check that one out.
Yeah, it was a really great episode, I think, that we did on my one, sharing all your expertise around actually hosting a podcast. And obviously that's a bit what we're talking about today, but definitely come and check out Anne's episode because it was really great.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about your podcast? What's She's the Business podcast?
Absolutely. So the podcast, She's the Business, a little bit's in the name. It is for women in business, female entrepreneurs, and particularly, in the area that I work in, which is coaches, service providers, because I feel like we have a specific style and type of business. It's not the same as running an e-commerce business or a product-based manufacturing style business. We have different challenges. Everything about it's different. And I feel like a lot of what's out there, the business advice, the marketing advice that you get is heavily focused on product-based business, but they don't normally say so. It's just assumed that most people have a product-based business because we're all consumers. They surround us in our daily lives. And I think that it's really important that we bring more of a service-based focus conversations to people's ears, to the world, because there are so many things that are really different when we're talking about strategy for services, especially when you're any type of expert, whether or not you like to call yourself an expert, but you are one if you offer a service. If you have expertise in something, then you are an expert. So, that is really the background for it. And I really wanted to, I guess part of why I came into business in the first place was to help other women. I had experienced an environment that wasn't that conducive to supporting women as they're entering motherhood when I was in the corporate world. And, I thought, well, why can't women have a career or a business and be a mom? Like, why are people telling me I've got to choose one of these things? I just thought that's ridiculous. And so I started this business thinking, well, I want to not only prove them all wrong, but also support other women to do it as well. And like really have this, groundswell community of women who are all succeeding really well in their own business while they're raising a family. So, when I started She's Business podcast, it was just a different way to help reach women, to share knowledge, expertise, to help people feel like there are others out there just like you. And that's why I interview another female entrepreneur every second episode. So every second week, I'm bringing somebody else onto the podcast and, talking about their business, their story, and sharing some of their own insights and advice and whatever their expertise is as well with the audience. So that was kind of the reason for it. And it's been the best decision ever. Been going strong.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think those inspiring stories can be so powerful because you can see that it exists, right? All these women are doing the thing, that you want to do. So it is possible, it exists, and yeah, it's so powerful. And then you also have your solo episodes, right? That you really share your own expertise and those tips and tricks and actionable advice that people can take away from it, which is really helpful as well. Can you talk a little bit more about how it was to start the podcast? Like in the process of launching it, how did you launch it? Did you work with someone, or did you do it on your own, maybe with a VA? Can you share a little bit more about that process?
Yeah, absolutely. So interestingly, someone who came from a marketing background, I was very used to writing, and I started my business doing blogging and a lot of writing. And I thought that was my thing. And I'm not sure where the idea came up, but I'd started to do some Facebook lives or Instagram lives. And I thought, you know what, I actually quite like talking. This feels much easier to me to talk rather than write. And even though writing wasn't something I used to be afraid of, I did it all the time. I used to be paid to do it. But I started to think, well, what if I had a podcast? And I had a lot of confusion around what it would be, how I would do it. I didn't know anything about it. I'd never done it before, but I started to save a lot of my lives as just into a Google Drive. Like, I'm going to save that file, the video, audio file. And I was just putting it away, thinking, well, if I start a podcast, then I could use some of this existing content, maybe, as either episodes, or I could put them together. And I just was kind of collecting a bit of a bank of information. This probably went on for about 2 years until I started to think, you know what, if I don't launch this podcast now, this content's going to be too old. It's not going to be relevant. It will, I'll end up just throwing it away. And, it was fine because I'd already used it for whatever I created it for. But I sort of felt like I've got this big asset now. I actually had a massive stack of content by then. And it got to that point one day where I thought, you know what, I am busy. This isn't my area of expertise. I could figure it out. I know I'm quite tech savvy. I could read up on it and I could figure out what to do. But I'm actually just going to reach out to someone who's been recommended to me and ask them to help me. And so I did reach out to a guy who's locally here in Australia. He's actually I think he's hosted many radio shows, and he also has his own podcasts, and he'd helped many other people set up theirs and hosted them. So I just dove in. I thought, I'm going straight to the expert. He can just tell me what I need to do, tell me what to provide, and I will kind of put myself in his hands in terms of getting it up and running. So for me, that was a really great decision. It wasn't super costly at all, and it saved me so much time. But having somebody who already knew the ins and outs, already knew what to do, even down to the intro for the podcast, he's like, well, make it about this long, and these are the things you want to include. And I did a few samples, and then he'd say, well, how about you try this or that? And there were just a few little pieces of advice that I wouldn't have known whether I was doing a good job or not. And so getting that up and running was super, super helpful. I worked with him for a few months, maybe about 3 months, but I sort of was like, right, now I'm underway. I got a process together, and I moved over to having more of like a podcast VA. So I do have a podcast manager who manages this podcast. He's amazing. And does the editing, puts the pieces together for me. But we've got a really well nailed down process behind it, which means that we know exactly what's happening, what needs to be done, who's doing what, and it just sort of works like a machine, really, which is wonderful.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I absolutely hear you. I remember when I launched my very first podcast, you just don't know what you don't know, right? Mm-hmm. So there is a list of things that you're like, okay, I need this. But then while I was going through the launch process for the very first time, I was like, oh, but wait, I also need this piece, and I need this piece, and I need a graphic here, and I need an intro there. Yeah. It was quite hectic. So it's good to hear that you hired help from the start and that you could work with an expert to actually tell you what to do, take away some of that stress, because it's exciting, but it can also be a little bit scary, right? To start a podcast and put yourself out there like that and be visible like that. So I think taking away some of that stress, that sounds actually really good. And wise
I think it
decision.
was, I'd procrastinated on it for so long. I just thought, I've just got to do it. And the only way I'm going to get it done is if I have support, because as soon as I'm doing it all, I already just didn't have the time to do that. So it was really, thought, well, I'm going to invest in this. This is what I'm putting my time and effort into. And I didn't want to, I actually had already decided I wasn't just going to try it and then decide whether I keep it or not. But I was like, nope, this is what I'm going all in on. I am really keen to give it a really good go. So that was really, really helpful. And, I guess I wanted to share, I know that sounds like I've got it all figured out, but there's so many areas of the podcast that right now, even, coming up to my third year, we're almost 200 episodes in. I'm like, I have really not even scratched the surface of this, particularly with the video part. So we record video and I do share them on YouTube. But right now it's been like, okay, we have video content, put it up. And I think the most that we've done is really create a thumbnail for it, which again is not, I look at it and I think that could be so much better. Like we're really, there's a lot of places that we're not doing what I would think is a fantastic job in it. It's more, well, done is better than not doing it. So it's better to put it up there than to not put it up at all. But I see, I guess I wanted to share that because I know that you can hear somebody talk about what they've done and how they've got a system in place, and it all sounds really like hunky-dory and, wow, how amazing. And that's almost scary or like such a big gap from where you might be. But I just think it's important to know, even if we seem to have it figured out, there are things that on the inside we're feeling like, well, we don't have that figured out yet. There are certainly parts that I'm very comfortable with now, but there are so much potential still that I'm not even tapping into at all with it. I think
Yeah.
it's exciting because it means for me there's always something else that we could be doing, and as soon as there's some bandwidth and extra time, we can be like, okay, let's have a look and let's update our YouTube thumbnails. Let's actually
Yeah.
start to optimize the podcast there because there's a huge untapped, resource there that we're not even leveraging for the podcast yet.
Yeah, there's room for growth. And thank you for sharing that because I think that's so important. Done is better than perfect, right? Sometimes you just have to get the content out there. And it's so true. Like I shared this with you, Jessica, just before we hit record. I live above a daycare at the moment. And we're recording a little bit earlier in my day because Jessica is in Australia, I'm in Europe. So this time zone just worked. So you might hear some kids screaming in this episode. So far, so good. They're not outside, but that actually might happen. And for me, it was also a decision like, okay, what are we going to do? Are we going to not record this interview, but I really want Jessica on the podcast? Or will we just go for it? And it might not be perfect, but we'll have the super valuable content. So yeah, I also made the decision to go for done over perfect. And I think honestly, that's the only way to go, because if you want to have all the pieces in place, like literally everything from video, and then there's also YouTube shorts, and you can do reels and LinkedIn posts, like there is an endless list of things that you can do with the podcast. So I think what you do, Jessica, just start, make sure that you create the kind of the systems for yourself to start. So if that's hiring someone to help you, it also provides accountability, right? Because once you hire someone, you put money into it, then you have to, right? You cannot put it off any longer. And then just start where you're at, and then you can always grow and increase content from there on, or do more promotion, do more marketing. All of that is always possible down the road. But I think, the only way is to just get started and get some content out there and then improve as you go, for sure. Yeah. So you're almost 200 episodes in now, Jessica. Can you share a little bit more of like what changed from launching 3 years ago to now? I think I was just looking at your website, obviously, before this interview, and I think you're at 191 now, episode 191, which is so much content. yeah, what else changed, or what did you learn? What did you change in the process or for the podcast?
Mm, that's a good question. Since I started, I think that the main thing that I have changed, if there is anything, I guess it's been more of like an evolution. So for me, there hasn't felt like a huge change at all. But one thing I did change, which I did some episodes on around my 100th, was I had been producing 2 episodes a week and doing one with a guest and one solo one when I launched. I did it for a whole year. And,
Wow.
so I got to the 100th episode around then, and I did an announcement. I said, well, I've kept this up for an entire year, but I can recognize that this is actually too much for me and for my business and the resources that I have to be producing that much content. And so, I said, look, I'm dropping it down to one per week, and I've kept that up ever since. So that was a change, and I think it's really important to be present to what's going to work for you. But maybe I could have even had that insight before I started it, to think what's going to be a really good cadence for episodes that I know that I can commit to. It's not going to feel too stressful, and it's going to be viable and easy and fun and exciting for me to do. So, that was one of the mistakes I made, I think, was, being an overachiever, being that sort of type of person where I'm like, yeah, I can do 2 episodes a week, easy. And I had this big bank of content, as I mentioned before, already there at my fingertips. So it was like, well, if I don't get one done, I can pull something out of the archive that I've already got that I haven't used before on the podcast. So, I think that was why I was able to keep it up for so long, without everything falling apart. But if I hadn't had the content, that would have felt super hard. And one a week is good. I try to keep really far ahead with my recording. So my guest recordings, I've already recorded pretty much the rest of this year already. I'm somewhere in December with my episodes. But my solo ones are much more, they're happening the week before, or maybe a couple of weeks before at most. So you're getting those ones really fresh. You're getting my insights as they're happening. I'm responding to what's going on outside in the world. I'm often talking about what I'm seeing, what I notice happening out there, and bringing that onto the podcast. So I feel like it's a really nice balance there, where the only pressure is on me to do the recording. I'm not having to get someone
Mhm.
into an interview at the last minute. So that's worked out well for me to actually get ahead of myself with the guest recordings, and have a really good stack in there. I think, over time, I've probably become a little bit more strategic in a way with who I invite onto the podcast. I'm not just out there to get any guest on. I'm like, well, who is this person? Are they aligned for my audience? Is it someone my audience is going to want to listen to? Do I think they're interesting? Because I kind of, my episodes, like our one here, is very unscripted. I get someone in, we have a topic that we're going to talk about, but I like to just be able to ask whatever question comes into my mind, and to flow the conversation, really see what they have to offer, and what's interesting. So I tend to ask questions based on what I'm interested to know more about, which I think works really well for my audience. I have a lot of people say that they really enjoy the episodes, and I think it's because of that ability to not have the structure, and to shape it based on that interest factor. But it also means I'm, you know, really careful about who I'm bringing on and what their reason for coming on the podcast is. So I
Mhm.
have a guest application process. Not everybody gets accepted. They definitely get vetted
Yeah.
as to, the right fit, more so than anything else, and it's easy to tell who's the right fit, because people who are the wrong fit tend to be just all in it for them. It's like they're spraying everybody with their podcast application, and they're like, here's my one sheet. It's all about me, and here are all the topics. And I was like, if you haven't even taken the time to look at my podcast and see what it's about, and whether you're relevant,
Yeah.
and what topic would be relevant for you to bring to my audience, then I don't even think we're going anywhere from here. Like, it's just an outright
Mhm.
no, because they're clearly not a collaborative person. They're just in it for themselves. And I think that
Yeah.
always comes
That
through in
value
an
first
episode.
approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to have a really good conversation with someone. I don't want someone thinking they're coming on my podcast to get some free advertising for their book or whatever
Yeah.
it is that they're doing. I'm like, it's great if you've written a book, but I'm not doing an episode on your book. Like, what is this? What is this actually about that my audience is going to want to listen to? And if they're not able to articulate that up front, then it's a bit of a sign that it's not going to work as good content, good quality content.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the things that you changed, I would say probably making the time commitment work for you, make it sustainable to keep going and stay consistent as one thing. And then also being more strategic about who comes on the podcast and what your content is about, that it works really well for your audience, and kind of like protecting your audience from too like salesy episodes, especially when it's not aligned with your brand. I think that makes a lot of sense. What did you see in terms of results from the podcast? And I'm not asking specifically about download numbers, because download numbers is really only one measure of success, and often not even the best measure of success, in my opinion, for podcasters, especially podcasters with a business. But can you share a little bit more about what your podcast has done for you and for your business?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, the main one is that when I have people who've booked in a call with me, an intro call, and they're interested in working with me, I began to notice, especially once I was past that first year of having the podcast, that most of them are saying, "Oh, I was listening to your podcast," or "I've been listening to you on the podcast." And that's I guess it's no real great surprise, but it was really interesting. And I'm like, okay, so now I'm starting to see what that value is that I'm putting out there, in being able to have some content where it's not just that 3 seconds or less than, whatever it is now. When you scroll in social media, you see someone's post, and I used to put so much energy and effort into my posts. I probably still do, because I can't help it. I always have a lot to say, these captions, and I think about it so much. What is it that I'm really trying to, deliver today and help people with? But I think that when you have something like a podcast, I love the fact that it's got a voice element, so that, you're reaching people through more senses. They can hear you, and they can experience your cadence, your tone, they can feel your energy, your vibe, your authenticity. They can very much hear your expertise without you necessarily needing to say the words. It's like you can tell when somebody is faking it, or when someone really knows their stuff. You can tell when they are really into it and they're passionate. There's so much that you can tell just by listening to someone. And I think that the value to me of having the podcast is 100% in, that level of credibility and ability to attract the right clients, because they're very much aligned with what I say, and, the views or perspectives that I give on the podcast. I'm obviously attracting people in who very much on board with that as well, which makes them great clients, essentially.
Yeah, they know you already more so than when they don't listen to the podcast, because they don't just know your voice, but also the way you speak, the way you interview people. So basically, the way you have conversations with people, what you teach. Yeah, that sounds really good, and it sounds like a very important asset for your business to attract the right people and your ideal clients. Awesome. Do you have any last tips for other podcasters? Anything you learned that you want to share?
Yeah, something came to mind just a little bit earlier when we were talking, and it's part of this not worrying about the perfection. Like, there's so many, we can get really hung up on the perfection in so many areas, down to the equipment, down to the room. And I think before I started the podcast, I was hearing people saying like, "Well, I've got this cupboard in my house and it's all soundproofed and I'm in here." And I was thinking, oh my God, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this, because I have an office in our house which doubles sometimes as a spare bedroom when we have guests. It's not something I can like pad the walls and make a little podcast cave. It's just not viable, because it's our life, and it's part of our house that we're in. And I guess I sort of went, well, I'm just not going to do that, or maybe not yet, and I'm just going to start anyway. Anyway, I haven't felt the need to pad that out. And in fact, last year we went traveling around Australia in a caravan for 8 months. And so I took my podcast on the road. I was recording it from inside the caravan in remote parts of Australia, sometimes in caravan parks, which were extremely noisy. There were like kids and people running around everywhere outside. There were noisy birds. There was all sorts of insane things. And, I thought, well, I can't just stop because I'm in a place that it's not maybe the most ideal sound environment to be in. I'm just going to have to do it anyway. And I did it, and there was no negative reaction. There was no backlash or people thinking, I certainly never heard any. Maybe they were thinking it when they were listening in. I don't know. Like, oh, she's so unprofessional because there's like chatter in the background or what have you. I did my best. I did my best to be in a quiet space and send the family away and be like, right, I'm recording, so you guys need to disappear for an hour. Sometimes they come back while I was still recording and they'd be opening the door and trying to get food out and we're in the caravan. So, you know what? I was like, I just have to roll with it. It is what it is. And I'm not going to get so uptight about this that I'm going to stop and then throw that episode away and do it again, especially if there was a guest. I was like, well, it's just going to have to be whatever it is. And I was hoping they weren't going to walk past the back of my camera with clothes on while they're getting changed. But, all of this stuff is happening all around me. So it was like, I think that to me is one of the things you will hear a lot of, if you read any of the blogs and hear a lot of stories, there's always the ideal, the ideal microphone and the ideal room and the ideal this and that. And you just mentioned how you've got a daycare center downstairs. It's like that might be ideal, but if you don't have the ideal, it's not going to change or it's not going to make it a reason not to do the podcast. Would it not be better for people to hear what you have to say, to be able to share your voice and your message, even if there is some, lifestyle factors involved? No one else is really judging that because they're here for what you've got to say. They're here to learn from you. They're here to get that value, and they don't care about those things. No one except some kind of sound expert is going to know whether I've got the best microphone or not. Most people who are listening, they are not experts. So I think that would be my major advice is read that stuff, take it all with a grain of salt, go with whatever microphone you have access to or that you can afford right now. You can always upgrade in the future. You don't need everything to be perfect. And I'm still here 3 years in, and I know that I could upgrade a whole lot of my stuff, and maybe I will one day, but it hasn't stopped me yet.
Yeah, exactly. I absolutely agree. I think there is some level of quality that you should definitely go for, even from the start of your podcast, because you want to make sure that you're easy to understand and that it is easy to consume the content. Because if you don't have any mic, for example, and you're just recording straight into your phone and it's a shitty phone, then people might start listening. But it's like sometimes I start listening to a podcast episode and then the audio quality is so incredibly bad that I just literally cannot understand the host. And it's so distracting that I have to stop listening. So you want to make sure that that's not the case. So I would say invest in a mic and either learn how to edit your podcast or get someone to edit your podcast for you. I think those two things are really important. But other than that, you don't need the most expensive mic. You don't need the most expensive editor or a full service podcast agency like the Podcast Babes. You don't need that if you cannot afford that from the start. You can always go into that if that is what you want down the line, or maybe you don't, then that's also fine. But I think, yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Jessica, that there needs to be it needs to be good. It doesn't have to be professional and amazing and the perfect ideal situation, especially when you start out with your podcast.
Yes.
So yeah, I think that's amazing advice.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about going with that as good as what you can do with what you've got and start there. But yeah, I think that's really good advice of yours, Anne, to listen in and really see what is the sound quality like, because if you don't have an actual microphone, if you're just using your phone or even your headphones, they can crackle sometimes if you're touching the wires and that type of thing, and it doesn't lead to the best experience. So, I like to be like, it doesn't need to be perfect, but it does, like, I agree with you, it does need to be something that it won't be grating for someone to listen to. So it's finding that balance, but making it work for you with what you've got, and getting started is the main thing, right?
Absolutely. Jessica, where can people find you if they want to find out more about your podcast and your business and maybe follow you on social media? Tell us where to find you.
Amazing. So I tend to hang out on Instagram, and I share some little snippets of my podcast there. So you'll find me at jessica.osborn. If you're into YouTube, I am on YouTube, and you can see my video podcast there, and some little shorts as well. So they're probably the best places, or you can find my podcast and everything about it on my website, jessicaosborn.com.
Awesome. We'll make sure to add all the links in the show notes, so you can go there, click all the links, follow Jessica on social media, and check out the podcast for sure. And also a reminder, we'll also link the episode where I came on Jessica's podcast, so that you can kind of hear the other side of the story, right? Where Jessica interviews me. I think that would be super fun. Yeah, Jessica, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It was awesome to hear about your podcast journey, you know, what you changed in the past 3 years, how the podcast has worked for you and for your business, and awesome advice. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Oh, thank you so much, Anne. It's been amazing to reconnect, and thank you for having me.
All right, that's it for today's episode. Need some help to get your podcast off the ground? Not sure where to start and what to focus on? Go to thepodcastbabes.com to schedule a call and learn more about our podcast launch and production services. See you next week.